Hello and welcome. I'm Jack Fink, and you're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth. Campaign season is heating up. The Labor Day holiday weekend is here, and candidates are now kicking it into high gear. The governor's race is the big contest this year in Texas. Two-term Republican Greg Abbott visited North Texas this week, and his Democratic opponent, Beto O'Rourke, has made various stops here as part of his statewide road trip.
Maggie, I'm Greg Abbott. How you doing?
In Allen, Governor Greg Abbott stopped at Maggie Pitka's house.
I wanted to give you one of these cards.
Okay.
That tells you more about me, but also ask for your vote.
No problem.
He told her it was his campaign's 2 millionth door knock of this election cycle. Among the key differences between the two-term incumbent and his Democratic challenger, Beto O'Rourke, gun restrictions following the deadly mass shooting in Uvalde. After O'Rourke said he would confiscate AR-15s and AK-47s 3 years ago when running for president, he now says there is room to compromise.
Raise the minimum age of purchase, for example, of an AR-15 to at least 21 years old. Have a red flag law so that if someone is threatening to use a firearm they own against students in that classroom, that we intervene before it's too late. Implement a universal background check.
I asked Governor Abbott about this today. He pointed to court rulings that have determined age restrictions on gun purchases violate the Second Amendment.
Most recently, a federal court in the state of Texas struck down the Texas law that banned people between the ages of 18 and 20 from buying a handgun. So it's clear that the gun control law that they are seeking in Uvalde, as much as they may want it, it has already been ruled to be unconstitutional.
Abbott points to his efforts to secure the Texas border, his plan to take at least half of the state's projected $27 billion surplus and cut property taxes, and the state's booming economy.
All right, Cleburne, how we doing?
At his rallies, Democrat Beto O'Rourke has said he wants to expand Medicaid, support teachers, and abortion rights. Polls are one thing, but the candidates themselves will tell you turnout is everything. Political analysts say this is Governor Abbott's race to lose. Real Clear Politics considers the race, quote, lean R, while Politico and Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball rate the governor's race likely R, and 538 calls it a solid R. We spoke with SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson about this race and the midterms in general, and he says one aspect seems to have changed.
Well, we really are at a position of more competitive balance than what we saw earlier in the year. A lot of the speculation early this year was that there would be a huge Republican wave that would just swamp Democratic candidates. We're closer to parity now. Democrats have, for a variety of reasons, kind of clawed back. And so it's a relatively even electoral landscape as we enter the fall, which creates more uncertainty about the outcome of the fall campaigns.
So are you saying that this is, at least for the statewide, this is anyone's race to win? Are you saying that this is really up for grabs now?
Well, Republicans still in Texas have an advantage. What I'm saying is that we should look for a more normal electoral cycle as opposed to one that's excessively Republican or Democratic leaning. And a normal electoral cycle in Texas means that Republicans have something of an advantage. So I would still expect Republicans to do very well in the statewide races, to certainly do fine in the congressional races. I just don't think we're looking at the kind of tsunami of Republican support that some people were focusing on earlier in the year.
So you're saying that this is still Governor Abbott's, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick's, and Attorney General Ken Paxton's race to lose?
I think Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick are certainly substantial favorites. Ken Paxton's going to have a closer race, and that's to some degree because of his personal baggage. I would still expect that Republicans would continue their dominance of the whole statewide slate of offices, but certainly I would expect the Attorney General's race to be the closest of those.
And so let's talk a little bit about the issues driving people to the polls. What do you think? I mean, because there has been this historically, the party that is not holding the White House always gets hit sometimes pretty hard during the midterm elections. So what issues are there that could prevent that this time?
Well, the thing that could prevent or mitigate that is some of the mobilization of Democratic base voters around the abortion issue. Because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade this summer, Democrats and pro choice people are more energized around the abortion issue right now than Republicans and pro life people. And I think Democrats are hoping to capitalize on that to really gin up turnout among some of their base supporters. That will help to mitigate some of the losses to them that are likely to come from the general unpopularity of President Biden and from their weakness on some of the economic and border security issues.
And what about Texas? Because we saw in the last week that Beto O'Rourke and the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor, Mike Collier, and the Democratic candidate for Attorney General, Rochelle Garza, really hammering the Republicans, their opponents, on the abortion issue and the fact that they're now in Texas, the new state laws taken effect, where there is a near ban on all, there's a ban on all, nearly all, abortions unless to protect the life of the mother. And so I'm wondering what kind of impact could that have on these races going forward?
Well, I think that we'll see Democrats lean hard into that issue. It's really the one major issue that they have that seems to work well for them. Economic issues lean towards the Republican side, crime, border, those all lean towards the Republicans. But Democrats have some wind in their sails because of the abortion issue. It has mobilized their base. And I think that you will find them talking a good bit about that because they'd certainly rather the election be a referendum on abortion than be a referendum on Joe Biden. And so I think that will be an important strategic element of the Democrats' fall campaign. Now, what's interesting there is that really hammering the pro choice side of the abortion issue works fairly well to increase support among some suburban moderates. It's probably not as helpful with Latino voters, particularly down in the Valley. So there's a trade off there. And it'll be really fascinating to see how those two groups may shift in the Texas elections this fall.
And let me ask you, because I do want to get back to that in a second, but I wanted to ask you, CBS News did a story this past week on the long lines of vehicles of people waiting for food at the North Texas Food Bank and the fact that the need is greater now than it was before the pandemic. And so I'm wondering, when I spoke to people just standing outside of a supermarket last month, there was a lot of anger and a lot of desperation by people who we interviewed. And so I'm wondering, how much does that come into play here in Texas, do you think?
Well, I think it will be an issue, and I think it'll be something that Republicans will talk about a fair bit. They will decry Joe Biden's economy, as they'll call it. They'll say, look, under President Biden's leadership, we have high inflation, we have increases in homelessness, we have increases in utilization of food banks. That's not the economic direction that this country should be going. So send a message to Washington, send a message to Joe Biden and the Democrats controlling Congress by voting Republican. That'll be a central aspect of the Republican campaigns this fall, because they would much rather the election turn on those economic questions than to focus as a referendum on the abortion issue.
What about guns in Uvalde? What impact do you think that might have?
I think probably in general, it's close to a wash. Certainly, there are some Democrats in the base who will be motivated by a desire for increased gun control. It's not clear exactly how hard Democrats will want to lean into the gun control issue. What they'll probably talk about is reforms around the edges, like increasing the purchase age for semi-automatic weapons, things like that, as opposed to kind of sweeping increased gun control measures. Because gun control, as we know, is an issue that has some support, particularly in the Texas suburbs, but that is a really hard sell as you move into the rural areas of Texas.
And my last question to you, and I appreciate your time, Professor, and that was just about the South Texas congressional districts. Up here in North Texas, we know that any of the purple districts before, the toss-up districts, the 24th congressional district and the 32nd congressional district, and even in some ways the 6th, have now become more friendly to the incumbents. And so really what's being fought over now is these 3 congressional districts down in the Rio Grande Valley. And when I was speaking with Republican Senator Ted Cruz recently, he predicted that Republicans are going to sweep all three. I don't know about that. I mean, Cuellar in his district is still pretty popular. Well, what do you make of that? And if that does happen, that would be pretty sizable, no?
Now, if Republicans managed to sweep all three of those districts, that would be an earthquake in Texas politics, because the whole story about purple Texas and increasing Democratic strength in Texas for years has been predicated on the idea that Latino voters are and will remain mostly Democratic. If that's not true anymore, it upends that whole calculus. And so that would be an enormously positive sign for Republicans if they were able to do that. I do think that's a heavy lift. I would be surprised if they won all three of those districts. But those are really the battleground districts in Texas, because Republicans during the redistricting really played defense. And instead of trying to maximize their potential gains in the congressional delegation, they really shored up the seats that they already have. As a result, that puts relatively few seats in play, and those that are largely those South Texas districts.
All right, SMU political science professor Matthew Wilson, thank you so much for joining us and for your insight today. We appreciate it.
All right, no problem. Happy to do it, Jack.
A lot of political news as we head into the Labor Day weekend. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins us. Ed, welcome. My question to you is, President Biden is campaigning in Pennsylvania and Maryland, but at this point we are not hearing about a visit to Texas to help Beto O'Rourke, presumably because of the president's low poll numbers. What do you make of that, and do you expect that to change?
It's part of it. The other part is that they're primarily focusing the president on those big states that often become battlegrounds in presidential election years that also happen, coincidentally, to have competitive statewide races this year. That means places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, Nevada. And so you're going to see the president spending a lot of time in places like that, because not only are they competitive this year, but they're the kind of swing state that presidential candidates focus on in 2024.
Correspondent Janet Shamlian reported on the long lines of vehicles at the North Texas Food Bank and the growing need for help amid rising food prices. How much of an impact could this have on the midterms and how President Biden and Democrats campaign?
Well, look, the economy remains the top issue of concern for voters. If you look at the recent CBS News Battleground Tracker, it certainly shows that. And that's why you continue to see especially Republican candidates talking issues of dollars and cents, raising concerns about how inflation has affected people like those that were in those food lines, whether or not the president and congressional Democrats are doing enough to drive down prices overall. Democrats would turn around and say, look, the most recent numbers suggest inflation is easing. Gas prices have come down predominantly across the country. The unemployment rate's in pretty good shape. And, while there may be concerns about the recession, they would argue that things are in pretty good shape right now. But you're also going to see Democrats instead try to focus on a lot of these other issues that have propped up to try to rally their base of support. That means a lot more conversation and focus on abortion rights, a lot more focus on climate change, gun control, issues that they know can help drive out more liberal or Democratic voters or left-leaning independents. Exactly the kind that Beto O'Rourke is going to need as well in Texas. Whether that'll be enough, though, of course, remains to be seen.
Well, that's the $64,000 question. I was going to ask you about that because polls show that Democrats have really galvanized around the abortion issue. And how do you think that that could blunt inflation in the economy as concerns at the polls?
Hard to know, but, we've seen some of these recent referenda in Kansas. There was a special congressional election that was held in New York where suddenly more Democratic voters than anticipated were showing up, or more people were voting either against restrictions on abortion rights or for the Democrat who just spent a lot of time and advertising money talking about it. You notice also in Texas, Beto O'Rourke is running advertising now that calls out Governor Abbott's support for abortion restrictions. He's seeing the same polling Democrats are across the country, believing that perhaps there are enough women or independent voters out there, maybe even disaffected Republicans, who are concerned that Texas Republicans have gone too far. Is that going to work? Again, we don't know. But there is early evidence to suggest it's something that is motivating people in ways they've never been motivated before, simply because we've never seen this kind of action taken by the Supreme Court that can slingshot into an election just a few months later.
Ed O'Keefe, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Families of the victims of the deadly mass shooting in Uvalde are demanding the full truth come out in response to that horrific day. And some survivors of the deadly Santa Fe High School shooting 4 years ago say laws passed after that tragedy didn't have enough teeth to make sure school districts comply with safety and security standards. The governor says more accountability and compliance are on the way.
That was one of the failures of what happened in Uvalde.
Governor Greg Abbott tells CBS 11 that laws passed after the deadly Santa Fe High School shooting in 2018 didn't go far enough in making sure school districts follow state safety and security standards.
We can see from what happened in Uvalde that in fact those laws either did not have teeth or they were not fully complied with.
The Texas School Safety Center spotted problems with compliance in 2020 after going through the emergency operation plans for more than 1,000 school districts. It found only 67 districts had plans that were sufficient, and 626 districts didn't have an active shooter policy as required. The results surprised State Representative Nicole Collier of Fort Worth.
That's very disappointing. That's a failure on the system.
During a hearing in June into the Uvalde massacre, the School Safety Center's director, Dr. Kathy Martinez-Prather, told a Texas Senate committee their organization did not go to the schools themselves to determine whether they complied with state law. At least one lawmaker asked why.
Not clear on our authority to be able to go and do compliance follow-up checks.
Records show the center said the same thing after the Santa Fe High School shooting 4 years ago. Martinez-Prather told a similar Senate committee, quote, "The center has no statutory authority over school districts to ensure this requirement is met." State Representative Tony Tinderholt of Arlington wants answers.
We need to have inspection teams go out and actually conduct the inspections. You're going to hear me repeat myself a lot over that. It's not being done right now to the level that it should be.
State Representative Matt Shaheen of Plano wants the state to take more control.
Clearly, I think we need to take a look at expanding the role of TEA, Texas Education Agency. Do we expand the role of the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement?
State Senator Royce West proposes the state grade school districts on their security policies.
That's why I'm advocating that we have an accountability system, that schools get accountability ratings, just like they do in academia.
We asked Democratic candidate for governor Beto O'Rourke how he would make sure school districts comply with safety and security standards.
We've got to hold superintendents, trustees, principals, everyone involved accountable to make sure that that safety is to the greatest degree possible guaranteed.
He also said further restrictions on gun sales are needed. Following Uvalde, Governor Abbott ordered TEA to require school districts to check all schools' exterior doors before classes start and each week after students return. And the Texas School Safety Center will be reviewing partial safety audits each district is required to submit. Governor Abbott says more requirements to ensure school safety are on the way.
We, Jack, expect to do two things. One is we expect to reach agreement on even more enhanced standards and ensure that there is going to be teeth to it so that there will be compliance. And I'll add to that, will ensure that there's going to be accountability at all levels through the process.
To ensure compliance, the governor created a new position in the TEA, Chief School Safety Officer.
Here's where we may need to go, and that is to impose greater accountability or consequences for schools that are not employing the best safety standards that can help the school.
Starting next month, the School Safety Center will conduct random intruder detection audits at school campuses. It will mark the first time the School Safety Center will conduct on-site audits statewide. Last weekend, some of the families from Uvalde and Santa Fe demanded Governor Abbott bring state lawmakers back to the Texas Capitol for a special session. They want the state to raise the minimum age to 21 to buy an assault-style rifle because the Uvalde gunman was able to buy 2 of those weapons legally at the age of 18. So far, there's no indication Governor Abbott will call a special session, but he has said all options are on the table. CBS 11 has learned this week that recommendations by state legislative committees in response to Uvalde may still be a couple of months away from being released. That's all for Eye on Politics this week. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jack Fink. Have a great week. You're watching CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth.